Bias and discrimination are everywhere. It's something that we as a society are trying to improve, but there are layers of nuance in terms of social and cultural context, personal perceptions, and privilege, which are complicating matters. This episode of Steam Powered is a segue, where I take the opportunity to share more fascinating stories relating directly or indirectly to women in STEAM. My guest today is Raksha Kumar, an award-winning journalist with a focus on forest, land, and human rights issues. She's also a documentary filmmaker and has written for publications including The New York Times, BBC, and The Guardian. Join us as we speak about Raksha's investigative work into the layered and complex issues around caste and sexism in India's tech industry. I'm Michelle Ong, and this is Steam Powered. Good afternoon, Raksha. Thank you so much for joining me today on Steam Powered. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about your writing and your recent piece for Rest of World.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so also I want to congratulate you on recently being awarded in the India UK Achiever Awards in January. That's amazing that you were able to be recognized for all the good work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. I mean, like I said, it's getting tougher to be a journalist, partially
Yeah.
because nobody knows what a journalist is anymore. And then partially because, yeah, I mean, everything we'd learned is going out the window. So
Yeah.
it's good to know that somebody's recognizing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always going to be places for people who are actually doing this kind of journalism as well. So it's great that you're actually being recognized for doing that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah. So recently you wrote a piece on Rest of World called The Enduring Sexism of India's Tech Industry, which was a really powerful read. And we'll get to that shortly. But I'd like to know a little bit more about your background as a journalist and, with your focus on human rights. So, what motivated you to direct your journalistic attentions to human rights?
So I started out as a journalist. I mean, when I started out as a journalist, I was an editor in one of the news channels. So I was the last person between whatever was happening in the newsroom and whatever was being watched by the viewers. We were close to 20 million, we had close to 20 million Indian viewers back then. And so at that point, I had the entire palette in front of me. The whole platter was served, and I could pick and choose whatever I wanted to do. So when I decided to report and go out into the field and actually see what interests me, it turns out that people interest me more than anything else. So it was talking to communities, getting to know them better, trying to understand their issues. That really kind of kept me going in a way. So that was the main reason why I thought a very broad umbrella of human rights would make sense. All the communities kind of fit into it. Each person matters. Each person has rights, and each person, there's a social contract, that kind of compels us to look at another human being like you look at yourself, and that's great. So that's how it started. So I started doing all kinds of stories in the beginning when I started reporting, but then it just kind of got streamlined to issues related to land rights, who should own land, who should own resources, what about forests and rivers. And so it was at the intersection of the environment, state ownership, collective ownership, like indigenous community. So all of these came together. So how do you like put all these issues under what broad umbrella do you kind of club all of these issues? And so in that sense, it became broader and it became human rights.
Yeah, and it's so true because, people are fascinating, but there's so many factors in the way that, interact in society and the environment and throughout history. So, it's such a fascinating space to be in and with such rich complexity that, you're never going to be wanting for finding a fascinating topic to delve into.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's probably another, like, another reason. Where do you go looking for stories? Well, people all around you. Also, I live now officially in the world's most populous country, so it's much easier to find people stories in India, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what was the impetus for writing the piece for Rest of World about sexism in India's tech industry?
I did a piece for Rest of World about eight odd months before this piece was published, and that looked at caste in India's tech industry. So the trigger for that was this court case that happened in the US where a particular individual whose name has been withheld in media records,
Mm-hmm.
he alleged that his superiors in his company were discriminating against him because of the caste that he was born into. So India has practiced a caste system for centuries now, and people who fall in the bottom half of the ladder have been discriminated against for a long time now by the oppressor castes. But then unfortunately it's gotten lost in the monotheistic cultures of the West. So you don't really look at caste as an oppressive system, because it's also a really difficult system to understand. It seeps into the society, it seeps into various aspects of human existence, and it doesn't stare in your face, let's say, like racism does. But it is still extremely oppressive, and it has facets which are deplorable. And so this individual, who in fact graduated from one of the most reputed engineering colleges in India, alleged that his seniors at work were discriminating against him because of the caste that he was born into. And so this court case triggered general awareness around caste, and there was also a book written on caste. And so suddenly everybody in the US began talking about caste and how the tech industry in the Silicon Valley is discriminatory and casteist. There is a very interesting non-profit slash think tank, Equality Labs, that works around caste. And they kind of began to spread awareness about how this functions, why this should matter, and how this is as discriminatory as other discriminatory practices when it comes to gender or race, or other very core identity issues. So it started from there, and then it was reported in India. The case was reported in India. It had a very clear India angle, but nobody in India was talking about the casteist practices within Indian tech industry. So tech industry in India is massive. The contribution to, I don't have the figures right off the top of my head, but basically the tech industry's contribution to India's GDP is massive. It also employs a massive chunk of the formally educated class in India. And so despite that, in India you would just talk about caste as being a US problem. Well, this is a problem in the Silicon Valley. It's not really a problem in India. So when I spoke to Rest of World, I said I want to investigate how caste plays itself out within the Indian tech industry, because having seen caste discrimination in the Indian society, I refuse to believe that Indian tech is, caste neutral, or that there won't be any discriminatory practices in the Indian tech industry. And also, Indian tech industry began as a hub of international companies in specific places, let's say in Bangalore, in Pune, in specific cities. But then over a period of time, it's kind of expanded itself. You'll see technology parks and tech hubs in many Indian cities. So it does mean that, casteist practices have kind of been incorporated into a lot of these tech parks and companies. So that was the first investigation. And while we were doing that, I couldn't keep myself away from looking at gender. It just happened to be such a huge part of the reporting that I did for the caste story. So every time I would ask people, okay, so can we talk about discriminatory practices in your company? The first thing they'd come up with was gender. So in a way, I felt kind of foolish to not be looking at gender. And so it took a few more months to kind of put together some pre-reporting. And then the editors at Rest of World are amazing, because they kind of they get it. And especially when we are talking about the people behind the tech industry, I think it's so all of these are labor issues. So done three long form pieces for rest of world, and all of them are about people who power tech in a way, right? Like the people behind the industry. And so one of them was about gender discrimination. And as and when I decided to speak to more and more women, I realized that this problem is not, I thought it's going to be, well, sure, like everybody talks about gender discrimination everywhere. So then, what is it about the tech industry, and why are we singling this out? And why is it that I need to spend 8 months of my life trying to understand how gender discrimination works in tech when it works in every other industry more or less similarly? But then when I was writing the piece, I realized it's very, very different. And the editors at Rest of World kind of pushed me to then go into individual stories, because they were illustrative of how the layers of discrimination play out. And so it goes from something extremely banal to very, very profound, and the entire spectrum is discriminatory. So in a way, now you step back and say, oh my god, how is it that we didn't see this before?
Yeah. And, it's such a fascinating space to be looking in. And obviously, if you're living it, horrifying. But,
Yeah,
it,
absolutely.
it's so interesting that it came from that caste piece, because I read that as well. And it's just one of those things where when it's so integrated and integral to your culture's history,
Yeah,
you almost, it's not that you get blind to it, but you take it for granted that that is a part of your way of life, whether or not it should be. And
yeah,
then it's the
that's true.
people who are affected by it who are the ones who have to speak up and say, well, actually, problem. And that becomes that's hard, because when it's such a big part of the background, telling people that they have to change these attitudes and change these behaviors is a monumental task. It takes generations of work to progress past that. And we're
Yeah,
seeing all of that change in our workplaces, which are meant to be tiny ecosystems representative of our broader culture.
absolutely. Yeah, and specifically tech, I guess, because tech came with the promise of creating a flatter world. It came with the promise of being non-discriminatory. Anybody who understood how a keypad worked, or who understood how this particular machine worked, would be the same. So in that space, to replicate the discrimination that has been going on for generations, it was amazing to see that play out. But also, to your point about the onus of pointing out discrimination, falls on the oppressed castes, which is obviously unfair. And most of the oppressor castes are caste blind. I mean, a lot of us did not realize, like, it is right in front of you, but you do not really realize the implications of it on people who don't belong to your own community, or who were born into a different community. So in a way, the people who have the privilege to recognize caste discrimination are caste blind, and then people who are facing the brunt of it, really do not have the power or the privilege to speak up all the time. So the system perpetuates, and it goes on for generations. And so it's in the IT world. When I stepped into the IT world and started talking about caste, everybody said, but I'm not going to put my name to it, I can't be identified in the piece. And initially it felt like, but you're an engineer, like, you graduated from one of the best institutions in the country. You are earning more money than I would earn in 6 months. Like, all of this put together, but still the person really does not want to identify his or her caste origins. Just tells you so much about how oppressive and discriminatory this practice is.
Yeah. And it's the same thing as with the gender discrimination in the later piece as well. There were also a lot of people who wanted to share their story but wanted to do it anonymously because they feared repercussions. And
Yes.
yeah, and that's very telling. It really does say quite a lot about the system that's currently in place and the problems and how pervasive it is.
Yeah, that is true. And also, a lot of the women chose not to put their names to it for various, like, each person had a different reason. And so, when you look at how pervasive gender discrimination is, so one person did not want to put her name to it because she felt it would, her future employers would feel like she is playing, quote unquote, the woman card. One person did not want to put her name to it because she felt that she didn't want to be recognized as, quote unquote, a feminist. Because the word is really loaded in different contexts, it doesn't mean the same thing in different spaces. There was another person who said, I did not face gender discrimination at all, and then went on to talk to me for 2 hours about how she was discriminated against in her first job and her second job and her third job, and then ended up saying, but hold on, but I still don't feel discriminated against, because the idea of discrimination is so different from individual to individual. So she kept saying, but I have a voice, I have power, I can stand up in front of 100 people and talk about my experiences, and be articulate about who I am and how I reached where I reached. So basically, I was not discriminated against. So it was such a can of worms. Like, there was so many things to unpack in all these conversations, which is why I guess it took us,
That
I
long.
want to say, 6 months.
Yeah. Yes, I can relate to hearing those kinds of things because it's one of those things when it comes with the idea of prejudice and discrimination. Because, yeah, as you said, there are layers and tiers of this. And at the same time, it's the whole, well, I have this privilege. I have no right to be saying that I have been discriminated against because of this small amount of privilege that I have.
Yeah,
And it's like, that's, you can be privileged and be discriminated against. Like, these two are not mutually exclusive. And the levels and the severity are not mutually exclusive. Like, all of these things can happen at the same time. And
exactly.
your experience is still a valid experience.
Yeah, it took a lot of time for us to reach that like, we kept talking about it for so long, and then eventually she said, yeah, maybe I'd say partial discrimination. I'm not really sure. And so the thing is, nobody can, it's really her lived experience, and it's the tag that she wants to put on her life, whether it is discrimination or not. But it also goes to show how much we are brainwashed into thinking that we are privileged and therefore not necessarily discriminated against. But this also goes to show that we are so aware of our privileges, for instance, that I had to, in both the caste story and the gender story, I had to look at the intersections. So in the caste story, there is an entire section of women from oppressed castes and the kind of casteist discrimination they face, which is significantly different from the men, and the way they experience caste. And similarly, in the gender story, there is an entire section where I had to speak to women from oppressed castes and talk about how gender discrimination plays out if you are from a caste that is not privileged. And so these interconnected kind of intersections of these power plays was also something I think one has to be really aware of. So the woman who spoke to me, from one of the oppressed castes in the gender story said, look, this is how I am discriminated against, and I identify myself as being a Dalit, which is, they fall in the lowest, sorry, rung of the ladder. So basically the most oppressed castes in the caste system that India practices. And so she said, I'm a Dalit and I identify myself as a Dalit woman. And so the way I experience gender is so different from the way, a privileged caste woman would experience gender. So all of these overlapping layers became really important to be conscious of.
Yes, it's just such a richly complex issue just because each layer of discrimination, each layer of oppression adds a different sort of nuance to that experience and
Right.
how people will treat other people. And yeah, it becomes a very difficult issue when you start talking about equity and access and trying to give people opportunities and resources in an equal way, because you end up having to deal with these layers of nuance on top of that, which adds political and social restrictions and limitations to the way that you can approach these problems.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, there's really, I mean, yeah, nobody can dispute that. That is, it's extremely complex. And also, I think, so there are two things, as a journalist, I'd take away from this experience. I knew that nobody had worked on looking at caste in the Indian tech sector before. That was pretty clear. Very few academics had even, I mean, literally the academics I've quoted in the story are the only ones who've worked on it. So there's no sample that I had to create. I had to speak to every single person who had worked on it to get figures. So caste story, I was very aware nobody had touched before. I was sure it was unexplored territory, and I was getting into it, trying to wade through and draw my own map. Gender, I was very sure people had worked on immensely before. So in my head, I'm thinking, why am I replicating someone's work? Why do I really want to spend this kind of time and effort working on a story that has been written before? But then the learning for me was that every time a person writes it, you come up with a different layer. So this goes to your point of how you were saying that all these layers are so complex and intricate, and there are these layers of politics and socioeconomics and so many things that need to be unearthed. So that is where I thought, hold on, there is still so much more to be explored. And gender, genuinely, I mean, we got figures, we have, companies are doing surveys, and then there are the diversity and inclusion, what are these, I don't want to call them clubs. What are they? They are like
Yeah, basically there are think tanks and
branches, I
branches, yeah,
guess.
research committees, all
Yeah.
sorts of things. Like there's so many different types of organizations looking into this. And I mean, definitely two things that are going to come up as part of this conversation are going to be, things like the glass ceiling, obvious.
Yeah.
Women in the workforce, you're always going to talk about that. And when you're talking about
Yes.
women in STEM and in tech, you're going to talk about the leaky pipeline, which for
Yes.
people who aren't aware of that, it's the reduction or the lack of participation, and I'll talk about that word later, of women or discriminated or underrepresented groups, rather, not discriminated, in these technical fields, and how the numbers will dwindle as you progress higher in your career progression. So, even if we're just looking at, rewind, go back to the word participation. Participation makes it sound like it's a thing that we actively do, but
Yeah.
sometimes like there's a lot of layers to that, because it's about how many people go in and how many people leave because they either choose not to participate or they are unable to for whatever reason. Like there's a lot of layers to that. But in the article, I'm going to mention some interesting statistics that you mentioned so that we can kind of work on that. So
Sure.
you wrote that in India, about 36% of roles in tech are held by women, 13 for management positions, and 7 in exec. For reference, it's about 29% of women in tech in Australia, which is slightly higher than the global average. And I don't have the exact numbers for management, but at the very least, it's in the double digits for exec roles.
Okay.
And those numbers are fascinating to me. I mean, the fact that the participation rate in India starts at 36 and drops to 7, and the global kind of average sits within that, that is a fascinating kind of view just to begin with. So if we wind that back a little bit, with 36% of women in the tech workforce, we were talking about how tech is meant to be like the great equalizer, especially in terms
Yeah.
of caste and, whatever intersectionality you're at. So is that what's drawing women to the tech field in such large numbers?
So over the decades, so India is a newish democracy, only 75 years old. So in the last 70 odd years, it's only in the last 25 odd years that the country's economy opened up, and that coincided with the development of the information technology sector in the country. So if you combine the two of them and see what an open economy did to the country, is that it not just brought in a lot of foreign money, it introduced the idea of consumption. It introduced the idea of of economic upward mobility amongst various sections of the society. So when people started earning more and more, or at least certain sections started earning more and more, they kind of pivoted from I'll only get my son educated to, well, I'll have fewer children and I'll get all my children educated. So that meant that more and more women, have been educated in the last few years, in the last few decades, sorry, than, women of
Previous
previous
generations.
generations were. So when you have, at the beginner level, so you have everybody going into engineering schools, for instance, men, women alike. And then when they graduate at the beginner level, people who are looking to recruit, they don't really discriminate between genders, because a 21-year-old man and a 21-year-old woman are more or less the same, especially because in India, as more and more women are educated, and more and more women going into higher education, it means that women are getting married late. I mean, there's figures to prove all of this, except I don't have them at the top of my mind. And then they're also having fewer children, and then having children much later in their lives, which means the sweet spot for a recruiter is between 21 and 25 or 26. And those 5 years, gender matters less in terms of recruitment, especially if you graduate from one of the premier institutions, and all of these are in generalities. I'm sure there are women who'd point out and say, but I was in a premier institution and I was 22, and then this boy got filled my spot,
Yeah.
which is a completely fair experience. But I'm saying in general, for somebody who's recruiting, the person doesn't need to discriminate between 21 and 26, because it's only much later that all of what you mentioned, the leaky pipeline, the glass ceiling, and everything will hit only much later. So the 36% that you're talking about are women who comprise of this bottom tier of the pyramid of the Indian IT, which is why the stark difference between 36 and 7.
Yeah.
But those women who actually go up the ladder are so few and far in between. In fact, one of the people, I think the woman was quoted in the piece when this professor at IIM, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, said it doesn't matter at that stage when you're starting out. Like, I'm going to pay the least amount of salary to the most competitive candidate who's applied, and that could be a man or a woman, and most likely it's a woman. Because there's also this subconscious awareness that you have time till you turn 26 or 27 to do whatever you want to do in life. There is it's somewhere there in your mind to say, I don't need to now worry about feeding a family or raising kids or whatever. Um and so most likely women have their clocks ticking, and so they'd want to prove themselves earlier on in their careers
Yes.
before life takes over.
Absolutely. And then, yeah, another statistic was that, women leave tech around 5-ish years, which is around that time, because it's that time where they're looking at career progression, promotions, or, looking to see where they want to go next in what they want to do in life.
Even if they don't want to quit tech, for instance, when you get married to somebody who's, let's say, moving countries, moving cities, the priority really of where you will stay still depends on who you're married to. For most women, I mean, clearly there are exceptions. So a lot of women, like in that 5-6 year period that you're talking about, end up doing whatever they want to. And at the end of it, if they do get married to somebody who, let's say, moves to the US or Singapore or wherever else, or even like another city within the country, they are giving up their jobs and moving.
Yeah. And that becomes like it's another issue that comes up a lot, particularly with academics, but more so with people with double career family
Yes.
units. Because, yeah, one person's going to have to move or relocate, and the other person has to make that choice of either trying to find a new job in the new place or sidelining their career for a little bit. And yeah, you end up doing that, making that choice, and more often than not, it's going to be the woman who makes the choice to sideline. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fascinating problem.
So these, the terms that you refer to of, this is, it's, I think it's an awful term to call it a leaky pipeline, but
Yeah, it is.
honestly that's the term a lot of the HR representatives use.
Yes.
And whether it's that or the glass ceiling or, post pregnancy discrimination. So this is not post childbirth, mind you, it's just post pregnancy. The minute they know that you are going to give birth in a few months, like a lot of the discrimination begins. All of this to me felt like it's not a tech problem, it's not a tech industry problem. But then when you like go closer to the tech industry and see how it plays out there, you see how unique it can become within science and technology. And that to me was again like fascinating. I come from a complete, like, my background is in humanities. I have no idea. I guess that's another reason I work on people behind tech, and I have no idea how tech functions. Like, I don't take to newer technologies easily, whether it's hardware or software, and it's not something that comes easily to me. So people being discriminated against this way, it was a great discovery. And throughout, we had, like, my editors and I had this conversation about, okay, why is this a tech problem? Why is this a tech industry problem? Like, why are we saying that glass ceiling exists in the tech industry whereas it exists everywhere else? And what is unique about glass ceiling in the tech industry, and how is it that we can highlight that?
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating because a lot of these problems, yes, it doesn't discriminate in field. Like all of these sorts of issues are life issues, not specifically career issues. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
funny. Actually saw a paper that had the subject the impact of childbearing age on employment possibilities or employment potential. And I
Mm-hmm.
just read that subject and went, "Ow, that hurts."
Yeah.
Because and this was across the board, like in general. So clearly
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to be, tech specific. But at the same
Yeah.
time, it also depends on the industry and in some cases how exploitative or how high pressured the environment is. Because I think
Mm-hmm.
as mentioned in some of the people you spoke to, if there were cases where they wouldn't be put on projects where they were required to work overtime and,
Yeah.
later hours and stuff like that. And that's also a separate problem. If you're required to keep working overtime, that's a system and a company issue. But in a lot of tech, they used to and sometimes still do encourage that. You need to go above and beyond. You need to be able to put in the extra hours. Sometimes you need to punch extra hard and put in overtime. And it's that kind of thing where they expect that kind of performance, but they know that there's some people who are not going to be able to do that because they've got family obligations or other things.
Rest of world editors and I used to have this conversation a lot about what makes this uniquely a tech problem. And what you're saying is what makes it uniquely a tech problem. Now, the thing with technology industries is that most of them work across time zones, the big ones at least. Even those that are smaller, are servicing the bigger clients and end up working across time zones. And especially the startups, which do not, most startups do not have a work life
No
balance,
balance.
idea of a work life balance. And so tech is uniquely, the industry is uniquely placed to
Exploit.
yeah, well, yes, but also make all the demands that you just listed. So the
Yeah.
demands of, work for longer hours, work later, like no work life balance, like all of that is very prevalent within the tech industry for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And so this was one of the things that came up when we were discussing it. So I spoke to a lot of the larger companies in India, and they were all multinational companies working across time zones. So even those who were trying to be compassionate with their employees' time were still working across 3 time zones. So even if you are, let's say, doing India, Singapore, Hong Kong, you're still doing 4.5 hours. If you're not, let's assume you're not doing US East Coast to US West Coast in India, which are 12 hours apart. Even if you're still doing India and Hong Kong, you're doing like anywhere between 3, 4, 5 hours. So it's still longer hours. There's still no work life balance. There's no social life, and you're still, the primary responsibility of the household is still on the woman, despite longer work hours. So yeah, all of these are uniquely tech.
Yeah. Tech and startup or entrepreneurship, anything where,
Yeah.
you know, they like to encourage the idea of hustle. And
Right.
yeah, it
Yeah.
just keeps spreading that way. And that's the kind of behavior and the kind of culture that's developed, whether or not that's the way it should be.
Yeah. 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 And so, if you think about it, these are industries that were. I'm thinking twice about using the word created, but maybe that is the word. Like they were created by men, who could hustle. And even if there were a few women, who were there when the industry was at its nascent stages, the number of women who were there was still very, very few. And so it was a man's world for a very long period of time. And now women who enter the man's world, at least for the initial years, have got to just become, they've got to
It's
adapt
shaped by that. Yeah.
to the to the yeah, ways of that world.
Yeah. So just, I know somebody's going to mention this. So it's about the visible women. So there
Yeah.
weren't as many visible women. So a lot of the other decisions were not necessarily driven by the women in these fields, however, whatever capacity they had in there. And so you end up having cultures and corporations and communities developed around the dominant demographics, more easily said, because it's, that's just going to be how it works.
Yeah.
And yeah, so when you are in this environment, and add to the fact that, academically, and, everyone's had all these papers written on it, women also have to seem to prove themselves more than men in all of
Yeah.
these ways as well. So they end up working harder, sometimes working longer hours, even though, they are technically have the same job, because they
Yeah.
need to be able to show that they're just as good as the others. And yeah,
Yeah.
it adds to so many of the different factors that, lead to burnout and people leaving, and or the leaky pipeline, effectively.
Yeah. 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 I mean, there are testimonies in the story where women have said exactly that. Like, we have to work twice as hard to prove ourselves. We've got to, whether it is in the amount of work or the quality of work or the quantity of work. I mean, they just have to work so much harder. But the other thing about invisibility that you said is also something this started out being we conceptualized it as a much shorter piece than it eventually turned out to be. So there were again a lot of the work that did not feature in this, not because it's not important, but simply because there's constraints. And so one of the things was about invisibility. So for a lot of these women in the tech industry in India to be able to function across time zones and manage their lives and whatever else, they really need an army of women supporting them. Now, these women can be their mothers in law, their whatever, like other female members of the family, or it could be domestic help, who are most likely women. And all this kind of a support structure, this ecosystem created by other women, so these women can be, a quote unquote productive part of their company, is also a very uniquely Indian phenomenon. Sorry, I don't, not Indian, but like Indian, um, upwardly mobile tech industry phenomenon. They all end up being paid a lot more. Like they fall into the top 1% of earners in India, and so therefore they can afford to hire help. And the hired help also happens to be women who are hustling, their homes and other homes. And
Yeah, it just ripples downwards all the way.
yeah, but within the female gender, and that is what is, uh, you know I mean, that is what makes us, like, highlight the discrimination, right? Like, it doesn't. You do have men in the family taking up responsibilities more and more, but then the bulk of it falls on women still.
Yes. And, culturally as well, very interestingly, even though, there are more family units where the men and the women take equal share in the household things, and we're getting organizations and companies and employers who are, more supportive of the flexibility of both members of the adult part of the household having these responsibilities, and, parental leave going to both genders, not just the mother. It's all these sorts of things that need to be encouraged to provide support for the equity. Because just saying,
Yeah.
we need to support the women, it's great. We need to do that. But you also need to support the men to support the women in order to
Yes.
create that environment where it still feels more balanced, and it's not just saying the women need a leg up. It's like, no, you need to help the men to help the women
Mm-hmm.
be a family unit. And
Yeah.
yeah, or even just a functioning household unit. So
Yeah.
yeah, lots of
Yeah.
problems.
In fact, some people even in the story come out and say that, they say we've got to now actually help the men realize, what the women feel and how women feel, because it's not that they don't want to be empathetic, it's just that they don't know how to be. So this is not a takeaway from the fact that there's gender discrimination, but some of it is actually true. Like when you speak to the men in the industry, they say, but so they've never really experienced being a woman, obviously. So their experience is from the outside, and they really don't know how to behave. As long as, I mean, if there's somebody who's actually teaching them, uh, while I agree that the responsibility shouldn't solely fall on women, it really needs to be communicated to them. And
Absolutely. And it's such an important thing that we forget. And I guess there's also that historical expectation that women just do things quietly in the background. And things
yes,
just happen, like
yeah,
magic happens. And it's like, oh, yeah,
yeah,
but you're so capable. You did that. Yeah. Do you know how much work it took to be so effortless?
yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's about communicating that to both sides so they understand this is actually how much work is required to do all of these things. And, this is the kind of support that both sides need. And this is the kind of communication that both sides need, so that we understand
Yeah,
where the shortfall is, not just within themselves, but within the system. And,
yes,
what do the men need to have in order to make this entire system improve for both sides. And like,
yeah.
again, it's not about the sides, it's about bringing everyone up together.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the system, when we say the system, again, if we're talking policy level, again, it's male dominated. So a lot of the policies, while they're headed in the right direction, actually end up becoming gender discriminatory unintentionally. So a woman who's quoted in the piece said there was a policy in the office where women needed to, essentially, like, head home before 8, or they needed to have like a chauffeur drive them home post whatever, dark or 8 or whatever, essentially in the evening. So that meant that most women automatically chose earlier shifts in the day. They automatically began working, in like whatever during the day. And the policy was right in the sense that the rationale behind the policy was women's safety, but the way they brought it about ended up being discriminatory. Ended up telling the woman, well, I'm not really sure you can work after 8 o'clock in the evening, so do you want to head home, do you want a chauffeur, do you want, like, you know and all of this is fair. I mean, it's fair in an environment where women are facing more gender based violence, and the responsibility is on the company to ensure that women are safe. uh, but it's a tricky policy.
It is. It is tricky because it's loaded, kind of, like as you said, they either won't be given the responsibilities that require them to use these services, which cost the company money, or
Yeah,
they have to make choices to avoid that so that they don't get discriminated against. It's that very fine balance of
yeah,
how we can support, but also not accidentally sideline again.
yeah. And all of these are tricky policies. Like you mentioned, parental leave. In India, there is 6 months maternity leave that a woman is entitled to. Now the problem is, so some of the women I spoke to said, why not make it 3 months maternity leave and 3 months paternity leave? And that would just automatically balance out the responsibility, familial responsibility. I don't know if that is accepted throughout, because we are not making laws for a specific section of the society. The laws are for everyone. So, how acceptable these laws are trickling down through socioeconomic hierarchies is something a lawmaker needs to keep in mind. And that's just, again, it gets very tricky.
Yeah, because there's also a lot of cultural stuff around that as well. Because in some countries that works, and you hear about people saying, "Oh, but this country does this policy and it works great for them. Look at, there's been no problems. They seem
Yeah,
pretty, well adjusted as a society." But you can't just transplant certain policies into a different country and expect them to work in the same way, because it's about the people.
absolutely.
So, in
Yeah,
some countries, yes, the parental leave that's divided between both parents works great because culturally they're totally okay with that. But in an
yeah,
environment where there's still stigma or there's still expectations in terms of what gender roles or marriage roles are, or, any kind of partnership roles, that can be problematic because it's saying, "Oh, but now
yeah.
you're penalizing me." And it's a difficult one to navigate because you need to understand the cultural balance and how to be able to provide the support without, and again, comes back to legal. We don't want to upset everyone because we want to stay in office, right? So
Yeah.
it comes down to trying to figure out a way to provide the support without upsetting all your constituents, and also creating cultural change so that your constituents are starting to think about things a bit differently as well.
That's exactly what it is. It's really tough. So I don't envy the lawmakers who have to navigate through all of this, but it's good to be aware of all these layers before you put pen on paper and say this is the law. Because a lot of the laws really, come from conventional thinking of how gender roles are specified, and it won't cut it going forward.
No, yeah, people need to be a lot more aware of where their blindness is, because we
Yeah,
all we all have internalized bias, and it's just
yeah.
trying to increase the awareness and communication around all of these factors so that we can at least first identify where our biases are and then
Mm-hmm.
kind of work from that to try and move forward.
In an interesting way, it goes back to science and technology education. So I come from a humanities background, and just this self-awareness to identify biases, to look at power structures, to understand discriminatory practices, a lot of my formal education actually did help me with that. And science and technology education in India, I mean, it's changing now, but has traditionally been very skill based or focused on on the technicalities of their chosen subject, and you're not really like talking about this larger idea of existing as human beings within the society. You're talking about, getting coding done or whatever else it is that, this massive field of science and technology offers. So this combination of developing human skills, or social skills, or just awareness of social structures, power structures, all of that can actually go into education, and it would hold a lot of us in good stead in the longer run.
Absolutely. Like, you've hit on one of my hills. Like, yes, absolutely this, 100% this, all the way this. Because technology and science are tools to help serve the people, serve humanity. So you need to think about humanity a little bit more when you are thinking about all of these technical and scientific and, all of these spaces, because it's not about just creating the next big thing and
Yeah.
understanding, how the world works from a science basis and being able to productize it, because it's about
Yeah.
the impact. How's that going to affect the people the product is released to? How's it going to impact society? How does it interact with society and humanity? And what does it mean for the people when these things happen? And, that's from a larger scope. But again, you're going to be working with people to make these products. You're going to be working with people to figure out what these technologies do. You need to understand
Yeah.
people. So, being able to have more courses which incorporate the humanities, either in terms of ethics and philosophy and understanding a little bit of sociology or, anthropology. It doesn't have to be in great detail, but at least get people thinking about it and understanding
Yeah.
you're going to be working with people. You're not just working with the tech.
Yeah.
That to
Yeah.
me is like, we need to make this happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. And yeah, to think about it, to question existing structures, I think the questioning bit is so intrinsically science, except within the technical fields, the questioning is lost, which is an amazing paradox. Like I cannot wrap my head around that. When you are studying all the subjects that fall within the broader categories of science and technology, the questioning is somewhere in the back burner, if it exists at all. And but then, the very idea of science is to be able to question everything and not take anything lying down. So then, how do you resolve this paradox? Like, why can't people who are trained in science and tech question more and question all the ones that, all the subjects that you spoke about, like whether it is sociology, anthropology, like just, I mean, gender is something which is pretty basic. So I think if this is tackled at the level of education, then the burden doesn't fall on the women to kind of make men aware of, the power structures, for
Exactly.
instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this isn't even just talking about tertiary education and colleges and universities. It's bringing it even further back into earlier
Primary.
education and primary,
Yeah.
secondary, because you want them to question, you want them to ask about the world, and you want them to ask about the potential and the possibilities. And all of that encompasses the people around you, even if you are
Yeah.
talking about the science. So, yeah,
Yeah.
bringing the philosophy of science back into the actual study of science. It's, yeah, all of those things that need to happen. But yeah, slow progress.
Yeah. Yeah, extremely. Well, I mean, if you're living through it, it seems like it's extremely slow progress. But if you look at it from, a perspective, I mean, we've actually progressed quite a bit. Like if you if you look back now and say, "Wow, how did we do that?" But
Yes,
yeah, it's living through it. It feels like, gosh, when are we ever going to get there?
I know. And, again, like, summing all of this up, it had felt really grim talking this last hour about all of these topics. And, it isn't a nightmare. Like, there are problems, but there are problems in every kind of industry. And it's just being
Yeah.
aware of that and knowing that things are actually changing. As you said before, we've got think tanks, we've got associations, we've got interest groups, all focused on all of these kinds of factors that
When
are
we have
impacting.
podcasts.
Yes, exactly. We've got podcasts talking about all of these things too. So, it's about awareness and increasing communication and, encouraging people to talk about these issues a bit more, to normalize it and, giving people a voice, which is what your work
Yeah.
also does, making sure that people can actually say, these are the problems that we need to highlight. These are the problems we need to investigate. And, a lot of people are here because they're passionate about what they want to do and they want the longevity of their careers and they want to make sure that happens. So, yeah, it's all the stuff that we can work on to keep that happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
With all of the work that you've done in these areas of caste and gender bias and discrimination in tech, what is the most striking observation or reflection for you when you were looking into all of this?
I don't know if I can put it down to one really. Like there were so many. So I grew up in Bangalore, which used to be the tech hub of India. It still is considered to be like the startup hub. It's still considered to be, I mean, if you are a techie in India, you want to probably be in Bangalore. So I grew up in Bangalore when Bangalore was becoming a tech hub, in the 90s, early 2000s, when it was just becoming this kind of a, so it used to back then be called the Silicon Valley of India. And we have all the big tech guys still, are headquartered in the city. So for me, I grew up with the idea that tech is going to be an equalizer. And then I grew up into, like, in my adult years, I was exposed to social media. Again, it was meant to be an equalizer. So for me to just look around and see every household have an engineer who's working in a software firm, but then doesn't necessarily practice, equality. I mean, it's a tall ask, but basically, you know, to be unaware of discrimination in their personal lives was a huge mismatch. Like, I did not understand how that was happening. So I think these stories are basically for me to explore how blinded we are when it comes to discrimination, thanks to all our privileges. And, in that sense, this tech not being an equalizer. Though I knew it, there's a difference between knowing it and then actually realizing and living through it. So there was knowledge of it, but then to actually see how tech is not necessarily an equalizer for was a huge understanding and learning. It was that was the journey of all of the last 18 months of doing these two or three longer form stories.
Yeah, I guess it's that idea where, tech is the future, tech is going to make everything better, tech is going to make society better for humanity. And in general, that's true, but you're still singing, like seeing all these things that come up. It's like, not so true. This is
Yeah.
not entirely expected, not entirely unexpected, and then digging deeper. Yeah,
Yeah.
that would have been quite enlightening.
Yeah, because like I said, we know a lot of things, and
Yeah,
that level of knowledge is great. Like, yeah, it's there, it exists. But then to go down deeper and see how, and then realize, that journey between knowledge and realization is a fascinating journey. Very tough, but it's tough, and it's painful because realization is when it's hit you. Knowledge doesn't necessarily always hit you. It's like, yeah, sure, I know about it. I
yeah,
don't work in tech, and yeah, you can just shrug and say that's fine. But realization is when it actually hits you, and so that journey is what is really, it's painful, but it's also rewarding.
yes, absolutely. And it's being able to share that realization with everyone else that is equally rewarding, and hope that, you start to make people think about these things in different ways as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That is true. I mean, I hope so. I mean, the people who've responded to the stories really positively. So a lot of people especially after the caste story, because, like I said, it was relatively unexplored territory. The people I've quoted in the story are pretty much the only ones, unless there's somebody hiding somewhere who hasn't surfaced yet, who worked on it. So for that story, there was a barrage of emails, Twitter DMs, everywhere, like my Instagram DMs, like everywhere they could find me, they would, there would be testimonies of this happened to me, and this is how I was
Wow.
affected by it, and this person in your story is an example of my story, and so all of that happened. Similarly for the gender story, like it just exploded. So after the caste story, actually, we ended up doing a Twitter Spaces where people could come and
Oh,
just
that's
speak.
wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah, it was, I think it was cathartic for so many people.
it is. And it's because you feel seen when you're one
Yeah,
of those people who are subject to all of these oppressions or all of these prejudices, knowing that you're not the only one in that space experiencing
yeah,
that exact thing is a relief. And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah,
true.
I love that you held the spaces for them like that. Literally held the spaces for them. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it was a powerful experience. Like all of us on it were, so there was three, well, formal speakers who didn't take up a lot of time because they threw it open to the listeners very soon. But all of us we were just like marveling at how powerful that hour and a half of conversation, ended up being.
That's amazing. I love that, and I think we need to have more spaces like that. Well, thank you so much, Raksha, for speaking with me today. Like, this has been absolutely incredible. Like, I've had such an amazing conversation with you, just sharing all of your revelations.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to go back to these stories to think about how, unfortunately for you and me, they're going to be relevant for a longer period of time. And so it's nice to be able to speak to someone like you to realize that all the work isn't in vain. It's it's not like I'm writing a story, putting it out there, and then just thinking to myself why I did that, because it's not changed anything in anyone's lives. But then spaces like this, isn't it just shows that there are people who are listening. So it's good in that sense to not feel completely irrelevant and useless.
No, not useless at all. I mean, your work makes an impact, and that's important. And even if it doesn't make direct change, it's still encouraging conversation and discourse.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for the space.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. So, if people want to know more about your writing and your work, where can they go?
So I do republish a lot of the work that I write. So that it's like a sample on my website, which is rakshakumar.com. That's rakshakumar.com. My Twitter DMs are open. It takes me like a few days to actually respond, but I do. And so these are the two spaces where it's just easy to reach out to me. And if for many people on Twitter, like, who write to me with specific requests, like a lot of the academics write to me saying, we're looking for sources, we are looking to kind of get perspective on issues. I do share my email ID there. So Twitter is at Raksha_Kumar. That's at RAKSHA_KUMAR.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I will share those in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you again. And yeah, it's been absolutely amazing. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Me too. If you enjoyed this conversation, please let me know. Subscribe to this show, leave us a rating, and share this with your geeky or geek curious friends. You can also support Steam Powered on Patreon and the Steam Powered Show, the link for which will also be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.